Are you seeing that then?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the title. It's me. This isn't official Wiltshire Climate Alliance policy, and of course we're an umbrella of over 40 groups and over 500 individuals. But what I'm trying to do for you is to bring you what the mainstream of climate science and climate activism is wanting to say about methane. So I went to COP26, probably just for an ego trip, really. And because Bath Extinction Rebellion were going there, there was this accommodation. And they introduced the Global Methane Pledge. So the Global Methane Pledge, that's it. That's all there is. It's not hundreds of pages long like IPCC reports. And I'll show you a couple of parts of it. Oh, and I'll mention that it's just a moment. It's been signed. I think it'd been signed by 130 countries, mainly the global north, Western countries, a few holdouts, Russia, possibly Australia, and so on. So it highlights the significance of methane, and because it's a short-lived climate forcing gas, if we reduce the amount of methane that we put into the atmosphere, by the way, natural gas is made of methane, and methane spills out of coal mines, working coal mines, and disused ones, and oil wells, working and disused. If we can cut it, then when it's decayed in the atmosphere, which takes about 10 years for half of it to decay, then its global warming effect has vanished because the methane has vanished. It uses up some ozone, and strangely enough, methane increases the ozone at ground level, but up in the sky it reduces ozone, which we do need to decay other greenhouse gases. Okay. They want to reduce levels of methane, and there are benefits for public health and agriculture and so on. And this is what they say. They commit to working together to reduce it by 30% at least by 2030, and take actions in all sectors, including agriculture, both through technical innovation as well as incentives, whatever that means, taxes, subsidies and so on, partnerships with farmers. So UK climate scientists reacted to this by saying 30%, it should be 66% by 2030. Like all these global treaties, there was a hard fought compromise in order to get countries to sign up to it with their oil lobbies, their gas and coal and agricultural lobbies. They compromised on a figure of at least 30%, so that as a large number of countries would pledge and sign up to it. Okay, so what's methane doing? Okay, here was what methane was doing. And if you look at the red and green kind of columns or arrows in the middle of this infographic, you can see the rising ones are where methane is coming out into the atmosphere, and a lot of it's coming from agricultural waste, and a lot of it's coming from fossil fuels. The green ones are natural sources of methane. So wetlands, if you've heard of marsh gas or the will-o'-the-wisp or smelt a swamp, that smell isn't the smell of methane because it's odorless, but it's the smell of other things that those bacteria and other microbes are producing. And unfortunately, if you look down over onto the right, methane is absorbed by soils, what we call, in the case of carbon dioxide, it's sequestered, but in the case of methane, it's consumed by bacteria in the soils. But the actual size of the bars, the width of them, represents the amount of the effect. So relatively small amount of methane can be taken up by the soil. All right. The Global Methane Pledge, unfortunately, I'll tell you what these bars are in the bar chart. Top one, solid waste, 23%. That means 23% of the countries that have signed the Global Methane Pledge have put policies into force or proposed policies to regulate the methane from solid waste. Less than a quarter of those countries. And those countries are less than half of the countries in the world. So the ones in blue are to do with basically the fossil fuel industry. The ones that I changed to red relate to agriculture and the food system. So there are policies for reducing the methane from animal waste. And for instance, cow manure, if it's left in big tanks bubbling up into the atmosphere, that's generating methane. Rice cultivation produces methane because of the paddy fields being wet, effectively cultivated swamps. And although there are other ways to grow rice, most of the world's rice in Asia and other places is grown using the paddy field system, and it generates a significant amount of methane. Enteric fermentation, that means the stomachs of ruminant animals, cows, sheep, goats, buffaloes, and one or two others. Pigs and chickens and horses, and obviously fish, and are not ruminant animals. I'll come to that in more detail. There are the stomachs of the cow. The green stuff is what they've been eating, and the microbes, it's a bit like your heap of grass cuttings. They're decaying that cellulose fiber mainly, and a lot of methane is coming out, and they are belching it through their mouth as they chew the cud. I found an interesting thing about talk on methane. The narrative sometimes include a sort of childishness, a way of sort of juvenilizing, and they talk about cow farts, cow burps. Don't blame the cows for their farts, that sort of thing. But that's the mechanism that's going on. And by the way, it does mean that because the methane is produced mainly from the fiber in grass and other feeds, grass-fed cattle, other things being equal, the science tells us that they produce more methane per day, more methane through the animal's lifetime, and I think more methane per kilo of beef or litre of milk than intensively fed cattle, which is an interesting and fairly little known piece of information. We tend to think, oh, these lovely organic pasture-fed this and that cows are better for the climate, and in a literal sense, in terms of their methane emissions, that's unfortunately not the case. Now's a good time to mention one other little fact. Some scientists who research the growth of crops and grasses and so on have said that as the climate gets hotter, grasses and the things that ruminants eat will become more fibrous, more rank and tough, and have a higher percentage of cellulose. So the cattle that eat them will produce, well, goats and sheep as well, will produce more methane per kilo of nutrition. So there's a little bit of a bad feedback loop going on. Okay, this is just a still from the video that I showed you. And I've done some arithmetic, and other people have as well. I'm arguing with another member of Wiltshire Climate Alliance as to whether the methane produced by a cow in a year is equal to the heating effect of 2 average British cars driving average British mileage, or up to 6 average British cars driving average British mileage. But that's the order of magnitude: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One typical British cow is emitting greenhouse gases to rival several cars. When I look at a car park, I think that's terrible, all these people using their cars, but at least they're not moving at the time. When I look at a field of cattle, they are generating methane 24 hours a day. I'll move on. Okay, so the farming industry, the mainstream farming industry, Minette Batters is a Wiltshire, is she dairy farmer or beef farmer? Does anyone know? Doesn't matter. You can tell me.
Beef farmer.
Beef farmer, thank you. She wants us to, she wants everyone to focus mainly on the fossil fuel industry. She wants us to concentrate on lowering emissions in livestock. And she talks about these game-changing innovations. That does include feed additives, although there are problems there. And another farmer, the one in more green on the bottom half, is warning the livestock farmers in the industry that if they do not cut methane emissions, they will fight a losing battle over stock numbers, because we have legally binding climate targets, and the Climate Change Committee in the UK makes recommendations and so on, and they talk about a reduction in red meat and dairy consumption of 20%, and I think they mean by the year 2030. Okay, so if these technological solutions and feed additives, they talk about seaweed and a chemical called 3-nop, some other things, daffodils, someone has just talked about, reported on. If that works, and breeding, the other management techniques work to cut methane, then the industry will be wanting to say we don't have to cut our stocks very much or at all. Okay, but now this is the world, and I do want to, it's easy to confuse what's happening in the whole world and what's happening in the UK. So apologies for switching from one to the other, but just like if you ever seen a chart of global carbon dioxide emissions, it goes up each time there's a COP, and it goes up each year that there isn't a COP. So it's still going up. And this graph in the Ukrainian colors, blue and yellow, show that whether or not the numbers of cattle, there was a 1.5 billion in that movie clip, is increasing or not. The emissions are increasing, and so that's a problem. They're not declining. Some of these technical solutions were available or talked about in the early 2010s, and that isn't having an effect. All right, moving on. This is how big the problem is with the food system. Our food systems, meaning all of agriculture, everything that's producing food, about, I think 70% of the land in use is either hosting animals, livestock, or is being used to grow crops to feed livestock. And that ranges from hay, straw, silage, through to beans, and in South America, famously Brazil and so on, soya beans to feed livestock. Now, because of the nitrates, nitrous oxide, CO2 to some extent, and particularly the methane emissions from cattle and sheep and the others, these scientists are saying that unless we shift the food system drastically, we won't achieve our 1.5 and 2 degrees climate change targets. I was going to give you a little preamble saying there's a climate emergency. Have you seen the latest headlines? But I decided you probably have or haven't. If you're not interested in acting on the climate emergency, you may have missed them. But if you reading and watching the mainstream news, you will have seen raging heat waves, wildfires, and so on in all the continents of the world. Antarctica hasn't got heat waves or wildfires because it's got no heat or forests, but of course instead it's got the pleasure of watching its glaciers melting. Okay, the next slide might be a little contentious. Just a moment. I'm trying to change slides. I think I'm on Zoom instead of PowerPoint, so I'm having trouble changing the slide. I meant to go back. Going organic doesn't help. This is one of several papers that says something about organic farming, and it's not including regenerative farming, but some of the same points apply. These scientists looked at the productivity of organic agriculture, and it's more extensive. You don't use fertilizers. You use, what do you use? Compost and manures and natural methods to keep the soil rich. And I do agree with this focus on the soil. But you produce less food, less kilos of whether it's grains, vegetables, dairy products, or meats per hectare of land. And there are limits on how much manure is available to fertilize the fields. So it's more land intensive, and I think these or other researchers said that we would need 28% more farmland than we have now, given the balance between plant-based and animal-based foods that we eat, in order to keep producing as much food in Britain as we do now. Now, where was that 28% of the land come from? It would have to be located outside of Britain, obviously, and that raises the issue, well, whose land would that be? Would it be provided by felling Amazon rainforests? Would it be provided by countries that need all their land to grow all their own food and so on? So the headline when this came out, this scientific paper came out, or possibly a subsequent related one, were saying it's undeniable that organic farming has a climate problem. Organic farming has a climate problem. And the problem is that on the one hand, the animals that produce the meat and dairy and the manure are producing large amounts of methane, possibly more per head or more per kilo of product than more intensively reared livestock. And on the other hand, it's greedy for land. Organic farming doesn't produce as much yield as conventional farming. I've got a hand up there. Shall I pause and take that question or comment? Jess.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. I haven't come across this paper. When they did that calculation, are they taking into account the fact that people have also reduced their meat consumption, or are they basing it on current consumption?
They're basing it on current consumption. I think the answer is in the bottom, in the last sentence. Would yield up to 40% less food if the nation did not change its diet. If the nation didn't change its diet. And the change, if I read that paper, is a shift away from animal-based foods to plant-based foods. There's a kind of logic to this, where if you take a plant and feed it to an animal that moves around, burning up energy, just being alive and breathing and being warm-blooded, and then keep that animal for a long time, breathing, and then slaughter it to produce milk, or get it to produce a calf, and slaughter it for meat, sorry, not for milk, get it to produce a calf and milk. Most of the energy in those foods is burned up by the animal, and a small part of it turns into the food product that animal yields. So I'm pretty sure that they're implying the need to change diet if we go organic, but others say, and the Climate Change Committee say, we need to change to plant-based diets anyway, regardless of the tussle between organic or regenerative and conventional farming methods. It's something that the Climate Change Committee has told us, and that's because of land productivity, and it's also because of the greenhouse gases that are produced by livestock, really the methane. Okay, so I'm jumping ahead a lot to just the last slide. If I can keep on having to do a little keyboard thing, sorry, to get the right place. I'm saying that Wiltshire is a large producer of methane. We talk about Wiltshire's greenhouse gases. The council has got a net zero aspiration. Wiltshire Climate Alliance is here to hold them to it and put pressure on them, and to campaign generally in the county to reduce greenhouse gases, okay? And the farm methane that we produce is one of those greenhouse gases, and it's a potent one. So if we just told farmers what to do, I don't suppose they'd want even to listen and give us the time of day. If we talk to farmers and explain some things to them about the importance of methane using government data and so on, then we might get somewhere. I'd like to engage with farmers and find out what their concerns are. Really, in the short term, this is about getting Wiltshire's farmers to reduce the number of livestock that they hold on their land. That's sheep and cattle, beef and dairy cattle. We can monitor it, we can talk to farmers, we can do a lot of things. Secondly, I'd like to see Wiltshire farmers bringing in the techniques and technologies of feeding additives to the cattle. The seaweed one is an interesting one, although unfortunately it's been patented, and it's not practical to give some of these additives to free-ranging pasture-fed cattle. And I can't imagine chasing around a Welsh hillside with a teaspoon, trying to feed a daily dose of anything to the sheep. I'm not against farmers. I'm against. I want to support the British farming industry, but I don't want to support it against changing. So I'd like to support the British farming industry, and here in Wiltshire, to grow less livestock and do more of the nature, and in particular, since we know that tree planting directly captures carbon, the more we do of that, the better. If we don't do it indiscriminately, if we do it in a way that's sensitive to nature and biodiversity, I'd like the government to give farmers lots and lots of money for doing that. Now, in New Zealand, sheep farmers are rushing away from sheep into planting forests, and that's a direct result of government subsidies. I've seen that the numbers of sheep kept in Britain have fallen and risen over the last 100 years by factors of 100, 150, 200%. We mustn't kid ourselves that farmers have always been growing this, doing that, keeping cattle, keeping sheep. These are big changes, and they have been made before, and they can be made again if we support the farmers. You know, I don't want to do like a Margaret Thatcher was supposed to have done to the coal miners, but I must say that if the Greens had to, they would have to shut down the coal industry if it hadn't already been shut down. Hopefully they do it a bit more nicely. Secondly, we don't want to make farmers or persuade farmers to reduce their livestock numbers when the public are only going to buy imported meat and dairy or from other counties. So I think that we'd be pushing it an open door by talking to Wiltshire citizens, the public and the communities, campaigning about the urgency of the climate crisis and how much difference they can make by shifting their diets towards plant-based foods. You've seen the plant milks in the supermarkets, maybe the meat substitutes and the veggie burgers and so on. This is something that the public seem to be responsive to. And then I've put the supply chain there. These are the middlemen, they used to say, the dairy companies, the food manufacturers. You might mention abattoirs as well, and the supermarkets, some of whom have made strong commitments to supporting action to mitigate climate change. So there's a three-pronged approach that I'm suggesting. This is actually the last of the slides. So I'll stop sharing the screen and talk to you face to face for a minute. More people than are here now than when I started presenting that screen. So I've tried to say some contentious things, but I stand by what I say. Livestock is a ferocious source of methane. Methane is a brutal greenhouse gas, and the video clip I showed you earlier saying it's 22 times as powerful as carbon dioxide, that's a figure that's not in use by people who are taking the climate emergency seriously in the short term, because that's a 100-year equivalent. Now, I've got an analogy there. Suppose you drink 4 double whiskies and then you want to get in your car and someone says, don't do that. Well, alcohol in your bloodstream has a half-life of about 6 hours or 8 hours. So if you say, well, my 3-day average level of alcohol in my bloodstream is below the legal limit, then I'm going to get in my car and drive, you would say, I think that's false logic. Now, if we say that the 100-year average effect of methane in the atmosphere, which has a half-life of 10 years, is only 20-something, we're fooling ourselves, because over a 20-year period, it has a 80-something times stronger climate forcing effect than carbon dioxide. And if you look at the day or the year it was produced, it's over 100 or 120 times a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And if we need to stop the climate rising, global temperatures rising above 1.5 degrees, then we need to all hands on deck. You know, you might be insulating your house, but I think if your house was on fire, you might pause and put the fire out and carry on insulating your house as soon as you could after the fire had been stopped.